everybody. You're all very welcome to our latest seminar called Intersectionality in Higher Education with Dr. Philomena Mullen and Aliyah Sai. Just to introduce myself, for those of you who don't know me already, I'm Dr. Rachel Hoare and I'm the Director of the Trinity Inclusive Curriculum Project. I'd like to welcome everybody, and in particular my colleagues Dr. Dorina Johnson and Sean Adderley, who are working with me on the project as project manager and student partner liaison respectively. I'd like to welcome our two speakers, Philomena and Aliyah, and I'd like to welcome you all and thank you so much for attending today for what promises to be a very, very interesting talk. So first of all, I'm just going to talk you through very briefly a little bit about the project, the Trinity Inclusive Curriculum Project. I know some of you are already familiar with it, for those of you who are not. So it started in October 2020 and its mandate is to embed principles of diversity, equality and inclusion across all curricula at Trinity College Dublin. We're based in the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Office and form part of the wider EDI agenda in Trinity. So for our purposes, and we spent quite a bit of time just defining exactly what we meant by an inclusive curriculum. For us, an inclusive curriculum is one in which all students, regardless of personal circumstances or learning backgrounds, abilities or strategies, have equitable opportunity to engage fully in their studies and achieve their learning goals. Thanks, Dorina. So just to talk a little bit about the project, I suppose one thing which it's very important to highlight, especially in the context of today's talk, is that really many of these barriers and many of these kind of aspects of non-inclusion occur unwittingly. So for things like barriers to student access and engagement, technical and IT issues, essential field trips, so students not having the finance or mobility to be able to go on field trips and perhaps not being aware of certain funds which exist to help with this, but also lecturers not being aware that some people could find it quite difficult to have the finance, or there may be mobility issues around visas to go on field trips. Reading lists and content, so for example, homogeneous demographic profile of authors or ideas and perspectives, pictures of conditions on white skin only. That's something that our pharmacy student partners have pointed out to us many times. Also barriers within teaching methods, so content delivered in one form only. So for example, just the traditional kind of talk and talk lecture with no group discussion. Inaccessible lecture slides, so things like font size, no alternative text for images. They're things which we can, as educators, remedy very easily. Academic language, complex terminology which isn't explained. So for example, the lack of glossaries. We find this particularly difficult for students coming into college and perhaps particularly for first generation students as well. And also barriers for students to demonstrate their learning. So a single mode of assessment, and here in arts where I'm from, the essay and the exam, which supports only some student strengths and isn't necessarily interrogated for alignment with learning outcomes. Thanks, Dorina. So just to talk a little bit about our project then, we've got four equal and interconnected pillars of project initiatives. The one in the green pillar there is the academic pillar, professional development and creating a community of practice. And that's led by the Trinity Inc. School Champion Programme. So there's a school champion in many of the schools in college. We're still trying very hard to recruit champions from the STEM faculty. We're finding that a little bit more challenging, but those champions are engaging in our school champion program, and the idea is then for them to disseminate the ideas into their own schools via committees and other means. We've got the student pillar, and that's my colleague Sean Adderley is responsible for this, and this is around awareness raising of inclusion challenges, successes and co-recreation and recreation of curricular components in partnership with the Trinity Inc. student partners. So those the experiences of inclusion and exclusion of our student partners are very much feeding what we're doing in the project. So very, very important part, obviously. And then the institutional pillar is trying to embed inclusivity in college policies, discourse and other key documentation related to curricular development and teaching practices. So that's where I'm trying to ensure that there is not just a tick box where you have so for example, if a lecturer was planning a new new course, a new program, a new module? Have you considered inclusive practices, not just a tick box to actually, but to ensure that they have to demonstrate how they have done that? We've also got a kind of wraparound pillar, which is our infrastructure, sharing knowledge and capacity across college to meet the support needs of all students. So that's all of our support services in college, which kind of wrap around these three pillars. And then the Trinity Inclusive Curriculum Advisory Board. I see some members here today. So they are our advisory board. There's between 30 and 40 currently members on that advisory board, and we meet with them once a semester to update them on our activities. But we would also be talking to individual members of those boards when we need to find out about certain aspects of I suppose the practices that we're looking at. And there's our website address there for those of you who'd like to, sorry, Darina, those of you who'd like to find out a little bit more. We've got another webinar on Friday, so just to draw your attention to that. It's called Queer Inclusion, Higher Education, Healthcare and Beyond. We've got Dr. Duncan Shrewsbury, Senior Lecturer in General Practice at Brighton and Sussex Medical School. And we're really, really looking forward to him addressing us, talking with us on Friday. But also we've got contributions from the Health Sciences EDI group member and Trinity student partner, Aaron Quay, and Trinity School of Medicine academic Dr. Lorna Rowe. So again, another very interesting session, which will look at issues related to inequity faced by the LGBTQ+ community. It will explore the importance of role models and allies. Very interesting perspectives that Duncan has. We've had a few meetings with him leading up to this around the roles of allies, discussing good allyship and active bystandership, sharing tangible examples and tips about how to embed inclusive practices at the higher educational organisational level, as well as how to emulate these practices as an individual. So again, you can register there through our website. Thanks, Rena. So moving on to today then, I just want to introduce formally our two speakers. We've got Dr. Philomena Mullen, commonly known as Dr. Phil. So Dr. Mullen is a graduate in English and Philosophy from Trinity College. She's currently Assistant Professor of Black Studies in the Department of Sociology. Phil spent 18 years working in the NGO sector, a great deal of which was with the Irish Traveller Movement. She was a member of the National Consultative Committee on Racism and Interculturalism, and formerly an Irish representative on the European Network Against Racism. She returned to Trinity College as a Government of Ireland PhD scholar to examine the racist and racialised aspects of how Black mixed-race women who grew up in the Irish industrial school system without families constructed their identity. She's currently the co-chair of the Race and Ethnicity Equality Working Group in Trinity, sits on the advisory board of the Trinity Colonial Legacies Project. She's a trustee of the Association of Mixed Race Irish and a member of African Scholars Association of Ireland. She's also a member of the UN Steering Committee set up to work with the Irish state to implement programs for the Decade of People of African Descent. I'm not sure how she's got time to be here today, but we really, really appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much, Phil. And then we've got Aliyah Sai, who's coming from a multidisciplinary background in languages, literatures, and cultural studies. Aliyah is currently a master's student in Identity and Cultures of Europe in Trinity College, particularly implicated by issues of identity, inclusion, and diversity. She's a self-supporting student and a mixed heritage woman from an underrepresented international background. Aliyah is happy to contribute to this event. We're absolutely delighted to have her here and to take part in the Trinity Inc. project to discuss and bring personal awareness of such issues. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our two speakers. Thank you so much. Phil, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Rachel. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's talk. And it's a brief introduction to intersectionality. I suppose because it's a mixed group, I've decided to not assume any knowledge of intersectionality. However, some of you may have a very sophisticated connection to the topic, and some of you, it may be new for you. So I'm hoping that I've pitched it at the right level. I'm going to share my screen with you now. Actually, the first thing I'm going to do, if you don't mind, is to turn off my camera because my internet connection is quite weak and I don't want to freeze, as happens several times during the presentation. So if you just bear with me, I will share my screen with you. And I just want to make sure that I have the right set of slides for you. Yeah. So can everybody see those slides all right?
They haven't come up just yet.
They haven't come up.
For just a second. Sometimes it just takes a while for them to load up.
Okay. If you can just let me know when they're...
Yeah, they're not there yet.
They're not there yet. Okay. That's strange. Okay, let me try again.
Yep, something's coming up anyway. That's it.
They're there now, Phil.
They're there. Okay, that's great. So I want to start by kind of bringing you to the beginning. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that while people engage with intersectionality, they don't often know where it came from or what its genealogy or its origin is. So I wanted to start at the beginning. So the origins of intersectionality came about with Kimberly Crenshaw discovering a legal paper that dated from 1976. Kimberly Crenshaw is a law professor, a civil rights advocate, and a leading scholar of critical race theory. And she came across this legal case of Emma de Graffenried and several other Black women who sued General Motors for discrimination. And they sued on the grounds that the company segregated its workforce by race and gender. So Black people did one set of jobs and whites did another. Now, according to the women who took the case, women were welcome to apply for some jobs, while only men then were suitable for other roles. And this was a problem in and of itself, because for Black women, it compounded the consequences for them were compounded, because the Black jobs were for men and the women's jobs were for white women only. But the women who took this case, they lost their case as the judge saw them as looking for preferential treatment. And how the judge saw it was that women could only bring a case for discrimination on the grounds of gender, and men could only bring, or Black people and Black men could bring a case on the grounds of race. So the judge saw these Black women as looking for what he believed was preferential treatment, and that they were looking somehow to combine both race and gender and therefore somehow gain some kind of advantage over the other two groups who would have only been able to bring cases within these discrete areas of discrimination of their identities. And in a 2016 TED Talk, Crenshaw explained that the judge's dismissal of the claim was, to her mind, a problem with being able to name the issue of race and gender as a kind of a particular kind of double jeopardy for Black women. So the term that Crenshaw came up with in 89 then was intersectionality. And she says that she introduced the idea of a crossroads as a simple analogy that it might allow judges to better see the Black women's issue, in which each street is a category of identity, such as gender, race, or class. And then the overlapping streets at the intersection is a metaphor for the way in which the combination of gender, race, class, and other identities or categories of identity combine then to create a unique position of either advantage or disadvantage. And then in 91, she further developed the framework in her second book, Mapping the Margins. In this, she utilized the concept then of overlapping oppressions, which she also termed intersectionalities. And so intersectionality would allow the courts, and I suppose we shouldn't forget that this original conceptualization was essentially as a legal term and was unknown outside of legal academic circles. But this conceptualization allowed the courts to focus attention then on the dynamics of difference, but also the solidarities of sameness in the context of anti-discrimination and social movement politics. And it exposed how single axis thinking, so either an individual is Black or they're LGBT or they're educationally disadvantaged and so on. And she saw them as really, they should be framed as being Black and LGBT and being educationally deprived. So single axis thinking then undermined legal thinking and struggles for social justice. So this term described how Black women's experience of the unique combination of racism and sexism were obscured by treating race and sex discrimination as separate matters in US law and in feminist and anti-racism activism. So while Crenshaw popularized the term intersectionality, she wasn't the only one dealing with this concept. And she definitely wasn't the first, obviously, to engage with the concept. And other scholars were already defining this concept of overlapping identities with other identifications, such as class, sex, and gender. So we see there, for example, Angela Davis had already written her book in 1981 called Women, Race, and Class. And as Bell Hooks also in AC4 was looking at feminist theory from margin to center. And so we see that these phrases, this term of intersectionality is really a continuation of concepts that were already in development, were already being used. We see interlocking was used in 77, intermesh, intersecting. They were all already out there and people were trying to grapple with this concept of how different marginalized identities suffered in terms of multiple oppressions. And scholars even such as in the UK, such as Phoenix and Bra, they pointed out that intersectionality was already recognized and lived, in particular by female Black activists, for at least a century before Crenshaw ever coined the term. And so we see some of these women here. So women from the Black community in the US, they'd already been asserting the connection between race and class for over a century, and gender as well. And Sojourner Truth is probably as far back as maybe we have, or at least she's the most famous, and her speech kind of encapsulates this idea of gender and race being kind of pitted against each other rather than being combined. And she delivered a speech at a suffrage convention in Seneca Falls in 1851, in which she questioned why she, as a Black woman who labored like a man, was neither seen or treated with the same sort of gentility and respect that white women were. And she asked the audience, "Ain't I a woman?" which has become a famous phrase and I suppose mantra almost for a lot of Black women. And then we also have Anna Julia Cooper, who wrote a book in 1892, highlighting again issues specific and pertaining to Black women born into slavery, also then becoming free women, how they differed from their white counterparts. And Ida B. Wells, again, another woman, a very famous woman within Black studies, who was a pioneer in terms of bringing forward the inequities of lynching and how it affected the Black community. And in fact, she was awarded a posthumous Pulitzer Prize in 2020 for her work on this, on lynching and the recognizing of the intersecting elements in the lives of people from the Black community and the impact of lynching. So intersectionality as a framework for understanding the impact of difference can't really be understood without some reference to critical race theory, as the term CRT is now so widespread in public debate. And it's usually misunderstood and often mischaracterized. But I'm assuming that it's safe to say that most of you will have heard of critical race theory, or CRT, as it's become this kind of racialized word, kind of negatively racialized by those on the right who oppose it and deliberately mischaracterize it. And the debate about CRT will play kind of very significant role, I think, in the upcoming elections in the US, the midterm elections in the US coming up in November, much as it has in recent elections in the UK, in France, and in other parts of Europe, as its opponents kind of paint CRT as a far greater danger to white people than, say, things like opioid addiction or climate change or high cholesterol, as has been claimed by Donald Trump. So the central argument of CRT is that race is a social construct, has no reality except for what's imposed on us. So while physical features and geographic origin play a part in making up what we think of as race, social processes and power make up the rest of what we think of as race. So for instance, 19th and 20th century scientists and politicians frequently describe people of color as intellectually or morally inferior. And then they use those false descriptions to justify oppression and discrimination. So critical race theory then is a field of intellectual inquiry that demonstrates the legal codification of racism in America. And in recent studies in former colonial powers such as Great Britain, France, Spain, Russia, it attempts to reveal how racial oppression shaped the legal fabric of the nations and was codified into law. So CRT now seems to stand in for anything resembling an examination of a nation's history and relationship with race, much as it does for conservatives in so many countries. And conservatives and people who feel threatened by CRT analysis even suggest that CRT teaches white Americans or white British, etc., to hate their ancestors or to hate their country. And according to Crenshaw, opponents of CRT are using a decades-old tactic, insisting that acknowledging racism is itself racist. So we can think of intersectionality as being one powerful outcome of CRT, since CRT scholars are critical of any sociological analysis that focuses solely on race, without recognizing that racial oppression exists in multiple layers based on gender, class, immigration status, surname, phenotype, accent, sexuality, and so on. So for example, a Black woman with a disability, she doesn't just experience her workplace, for example, just as a woman, or just as a Black person, or just as a person with a disability, but instead through her own unique interaction with the systems in which she's situated and which may each or together will have an impact on her identity. So rejecting the idea of race as a natural category, critical race scholars join feminists and queer theorists in the project of unearthing the social, cultural, and legal constructions of identities. So Anga-Marie Hancock, in her book, Intersectionality and Intellectual History, she references the borders that this concept has crossed. And intersectionality is said to have traveled. Again, it came out of legal studies in the US, but now it has proliferated across the academy worldwide. And we see how it's been kind of interpolated into mainstream academic and activist spheres, from London to Uganda to China, and also to us in Trinity here as well. But as we can see from the Crenshaw quote on the slide, intersectionality is often used inappropriately, even by its proponents, which allows its opponents to mischaracterize it to their own purposes. And one of the main criticisms within academia is this notion of people claiming to be doing intersectional work while never using either Black feminist theory from which it emanated, or kind of making it so loose and so diluted that really it no longer has the meaning or the context from which it emerged. So these critiques about its vagueness or its dilution, we can see it here in Cathy Davis's criticism. And in her article, Intersectionality as Buzzword, she says that intersectionality has been undermined by so much, and it requires so much debate, since the term can be co-opted so easily. But one of the main critiques within the academy is from Surma Bilge, who says a lot of discussion and debate about intersectionality very deliberately and very explicitly removes all Black feminist thought with its strong communal and socialist background. And it moves it away from how the term was both conceptualized and used, which again then creates this vagueness about the term and its purpose. So we see that intersectionality has been developed and utilized most prominently in the new scholarship created in the interdisciplinary fields of ethnic studies. It's come from women's studies, it's now in area studies, it's in lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender studies, it's in cultural studies, critical legal studies, labor studies, multicultural studies, and also in my own Black studies, and also in social justice education. So just to recap on that, individuals have individual identities that intersect in ways that impact on how they're viewed, how they're understood, and how they're treated. So for example, a STEM student in Trinity, when they leave Trinity to go on placement, whether they're nurses or whether they're medical students or pharmacy or whatever, they no longer are a Trinity student. They go into a space where they now bring identities that can be multiply oppressed. So within the academy, how we deal with this or how we interact with the student when they feed back to us becomes part of our identity, our institutional identity, and how we genuinely engage with intersectionality. But it's also not a hierarchy of victimhood. Again, another mischaracterization by certain pundits on the right, whereby now we see white cis men are seen to be at the bottom if we were to listen to people like Ben Shapiro. And this view seems to focus too much on whom intersectionality would benefit or burden. And the point of intersectionality, if I can kind of condense it down, is that identities simply shouldn't matter when we encounter people, unless, of course, identities do actually matter a lot to some people. And the people at the top of our current identity hierarchy are more concerned about losing their spot than they are with eliminating those hierarchies altogether. So intersectionality in an educational context, such as college, allows for the analysis of simultaneous interactions among, for example, gender, disability, migrant background, race, and class for any individual student and staff member, as well as colleges' organizational responses. So intersectionality helps explain how certain students and staff encounter varying levels of exclusion because of the ways in which college may or may not address or fail to address the intersections of their identities, and instead respond to only one aspect of the student's individual needs. So if we look at college as a microcosm of the wider community and world, if we adopt a uniform view of students, for example, which might be often embedded in educational policies, it narrows the lens through which we can support learning within the institutional context in which they work. So inclusion is an always evolving concept, and intersectionality also has to be thought of dynamically. And so within our college now, we are developing our EDI projects. We have our Trinity Inc. project. We have the Race, Ethnicity, Equality working group. So we see this within our ever-changing kind of space, that we respond to all these new developments and the complicated social inequalities that may change with time, and that we progress and evolve as we understand the diversity of the student and staff body within college. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Phil. That was such a comprehensive, considered overview, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. I see lots of people with the clapping hands, so very well received. We will have time for questions afterwards, but I'd now like to hand over to Aaliyah. Aaliyah, you're very welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aaliyah. I'm a master's student here in Trinity in Identities and Cultures of Europe. And it is my very pleasure and honor to take part in this seminar alongside Dr. Mullen on a topic that affects me quite directly and personally. So I'm a mixed heritage woman, as was said before, majoritarily Franco-Senegalese, but also Madagascan, close to the Muslim faith as well. So these are a few of my own intersections, and I could also add that I'm a low-income, self-supporting student. So basically, I will talk briefly about my own individual experience as a student rather underrepresented in college and in higher education, both from what I've experienced in the French college and here in Trinity. So first of all, let me begin by saying that I do have a very, very good time during my college years. And usually, probably like 97% of the time, I feel perfectly welcomed and respected for who I am. I also feel pretty lucky, as I never felt particularly disrespected or disregarded for the way I look. But again, it should be the norm. And I'm guessing it's not the same experience, obviously, for the students. I also happen to evolve within a master's that's very interested in questions of identity, and therefore both lecturers and my fellow students, classmates within, show the same interest and curiosity as me concerning those vital aspects, and they're pretty open, expanding and deconstructing themselves. In fact, a lot of them are from underrepresented groups and accumulate intersections as I do. However, and even though I did not consider them as such at the time, I too experienced those so-called microaggressions, those small negative interactions, which are often invisible to others and which you may deem insignificant whenever they happen to you. But those actually add up and contribute to some invalidations. Sometimes they even threaten your sense of belonging and contribute to you self-doubting, etc. So for instance, people would be asking me intrusive questions, stereotyped questions, or even the very simple one, which is, where do you come from? Very systematically and with a very specific answer already in mind, even though in my case, and I mean in most cases, obviously, this type of questions require longer, complex answers, which is not what usually people are expecting from me. So say I'm asked, where do you come from? And I answer that I live in France, that I'm French. Well, the answer would often be, yes, okay, but what about before that? And at times, like usually I would take the time to explain my background, and sometimes I just won't do it because people cannot see if this was the first or the 10th instance this week that I've been asked. But don't get me wrong, I am more than happy to share my story with others. But in these key moments, like probably during your entire life, where you are working out who you are in a fluid and dynamic way, it is not very pleasant to be reduced to one aspect of your identity, usually the most visible on my part, or to see others assuming your identity on the basis of your looks. Another example is the moment where in class, you are suddenly put out of your role of any student and given the role of spokesperson on behalf of an entire community you're part of, or entire minority, be it religious, ethnic, or literally could be everything. I recall, for instance, two occurrences. The first one was in history class studying the creation and expansion of Islam from the 7th century, where the lecturer who knew I was born Muslim asked the class, or rather me specifically, a very simple question: what's the color of Islam? With a nod like that, and looking at me only until eventually I answered. I actually did not know the answer, but quick, I remembered my mom had a green Quran, and I saw green like in some, I don't know, Muslim application and stuff. So I thought green. I said green, quite uncertain. And this was the answer she was looking for. She approved and continued her class. But the thing is, I was literally blushing. My ears were super red. And I felt quite stressed, not to know the answer for sure, and quite put to the test, even though it was probably done unwittingly, but still unnecessary pressure. The other instance took place in a class on racism. And the lecturer asked a general question concerning the history of North and West Africa, a very, very general question. I can't remember what it was precisely, but again, looking at me and me only, the only colored person in the room. And this time I truly had literally no idea what the answer was. And when someone else answered, I thought that I should have known this and I should have been able to answer. And I felt a tiny bit of shame there. Now, of course, those examples may seem trivial and forgettable. That's actually what I did. I completely forgot about them and wiped them away, which is, again, my own way of responding to that. As to me, it was way too insignificant, too small to be considered harmful. But always having to state how I came to be who I am, why I look like this, how come I can speak French so well? French is my mother tongue. Maybe sometimes tiring. The same way, being expected to be an expert on one aspect of your identity, Islam or Africa, you know, and being asked to speak out on this may cause unnecessary pressure, as I said, and even othering, which of course, according to me, is never the intention of the lecturer. In fact, I do not recall any moment in college where the intention behind those kind of interactions was to do me harm, but rather I saw clumsiness, poor wording sometimes, or simply unawareness. Or maybe just the desire to include me in some way, to allow me to speak more about something that they deem I know better. But yeah, that's just how I felt this. But if it appears clear to me that people mean no harm, it still constitutes moments where I am suddenly reminded that I am different, that I'm the only one looking like me among the people surrounding me. And this comes with a fortunately, very rapid and fast-passing feeling of not belonging 100%. So I was talking about self-doubt earlier, or invalidation, but those kind of instances, I did ask myself at times in some punctual situations, if I was filling a quota of any sort, if I'm being chosen to further diversify the student cohort, the student body, for instance, Or on the contrary, I was questioning or doubting the fact that I could be, I mean, that's it, that I could be playing in a musical taking place in the 1920s with an exclusively white cast, and especially since the Musical Theatre Society wanted to be as close as possible to the original. So yeah, I was just wondering, like, do I even bother to audition? Maybe I'm not legitimate, it's not for me and stuff. So it is very small, tiny reflections even. There's worse. And I don't think that undermines my self-confidence, since I never really paid too much attention to them. I'm doing it now. But they still exist, and they might not be lived the same way for other people. They might be worse. They might have a huge emotional luggage there. And in fact, they do remind me I'm not quite the most represented person here. So according to me, where does the institution steps in my opinion, to navigate oppressive intersections and assure they do not become something impacting students' career? Well, I do not pretend to have all of the answers, if any at all, but here are some ideas. I was thinking maybe to communicate more on concepts such as intersectionality, as this seminar is doing, since an intersectional approach attunes faculty and staff to the wide range of experiences in the student body, allowing for a better support of students as they navigate their time in college. This way, you also recognize the richness of the intersectional human experience, and you can become aware of your own scope, your own layers of identity that may or may not have put you at a disadvantage. But also you acknowledge that people's identity are complex, fluid, dynamic, enriching, and should be recognized as such. We might also create identity-safe classrooms, walking campus, or viewing campus from the underrepresented student lens, inclusive teaching, inclusive reading list choices, inclusive deadlines, class activities, or simply lending an ear and listening, supporting the voices of those facing layers of oppression, being curious, promoting, for instance, the ideas of a club or society made out of disadvantaged or underrepresented people, but also within class itself, addressing disclaimers when using problematic or tendentious wording in class, explaining the context and what is at stake when we use the word race, for instance. And why not just setting the standards of Trinity's inclusive and collaborative policy ahead of each year by communicating and providing more information on helplines available for students undergoing discrimination or what's going on campus about that. Like before I met Rachel, which was one of my lecturers, I had no idea Trinity inclusivity curriculum existed. So I'm very glad I know now. So basically all of those small initiatives and the big ones like the Trinity Inc. Projects are ways to making sure the college campus is a positive environment for all students to live, work, and grow as it's meant to be. And of course, underlying oppressions can often hinder this mission, and some are still likely to go unnoticed or unacknowledged. But such discussions are definitely steps forward to raise awareness and promote academic success for all students entering university. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. I'm sure everybody will agree that that was just amazing. And thank you so much for sharing, you know, personal experiences. And you've obviously put a huge amount of thought into what you were going to say and into the recommendations you made. So we really, really appreciate that. And we know that yourself and Phil have been working together to look at these issues. And I don't want to take up any more time now, because I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions and there's lots of clapping hands. So thank you so much, Leah. Really, really appreciate having your insight. And I'm sure that many of us here have experienced having students in our classes where we've said the wrong thing unwittingly, we've asked the wrong question unwittingly, and I think it's amazing that we're all here to learn how to improve I suppose the way that we teach and to be more inclusive. So I'm going to open the floor now. I think we've got 11 minutes, so yeah, would you like to kick off for us?
Thanks so much, Rachel. And thank you very much to the two presenters. It was truly very comprehensive and enlightening. I'm Surya, I'm from the law school. And, the one thing that I did pick up from both the first presentation and the second is that intersectionality can be misrepresented or misunderstood. And what I understood from both of them is something that I've been trying to work through myself, is that intersectionality is not a hierarchy of identity as such, but it is something which is about the politics of representation. So which we also got from what Alia said, which is that she is required to be a spokesperson for a particular identity sometimes, and which is a little bit strange. And I think that seems to be the key feature of what intersectionality studies, at least how it originated in legal scholarship, which is that you cannot essentialize an attributed identity, I think, is the way I understand it, and which is how it sort of developed. But here is something I'm trying to work through, like other than the critique which intersectionality affords, that you cannot essentialize an attributed identity, as soon as we try to put it in practice, do we also not essentialize to some extent? So, suppose we identify that there are people who are trying to work through against, let's say, a heteronormative identity, and we are trying to put in place an inclusive reading list, let's say, and we are trying to put in place some sorts of structural changes in college. Would we also not fall into the trap of perhaps essentializing when we are trying to put in place these changes? So one example could be that, let's say in a legal reading list, that I would want to include more Black scholars. Would that also not be a form of essentialism there? I wonder, therefore, should the approach not be more universal? And this is, Dr. Phil mentions the book by Hancock, and she starts with a debate there as to whether Foucault is the true intersectionality scholar, or is it somebody else who came after? And therefore, I wonder whether, as lecturers, as people working in EDI, whether our focus should be on, let's say, universal ideas and ways to combat structural discrimination and attributed identity, rather than very specific identity-based changes that we can introduce.
Phil or Leah, would either of you like to respond?
It's a really good point, and it is one that comes up regularly. How do we, by creating identity politics, we actually create this essentialism that we say doesn't exist, or we try to oppose? I think one of the things I would always go back to, I think your first point in terms of decolonizing the curriculum is not necessarily, to me, about essentializing, but about pluralizing. So it's about having plural perspectives within a curriculum, as opposed to having a mono kind of cultural perspective. So at present, what we tend to have is a Eurocentric perspective. So by decolonizing, it's not necessarily essentializing anybody. It's about saying, let's bring in other perspectives on this field or into this discipline. So it's about also looking at who are the gatekeepers of knowledge, and who decides what can be on a curriculum and what can't be on a curriculum, and what has value, and what. So your European knowledge tends to be universalized, whereas knowledge from, let's call it the peripheries or from the global south, is often seen as only being specific to that region. So what we would say is, in decolonizing the curriculum, it's to universalize everybody's knowledge and to see the value of everybody's knowledge and as having an impact. So knowledge from the South actually has value in the West or in the conceptual West, And I think to me, that's what decolonizing the curriculum is about. It is that plurality of voices, not necessarily essentializing voices, but plurality of voices. I also think in terms of this concept of identity politics, I would always go back to Audre Lorde and that sense that, yes, we can have identity politics, or we can have politics of difference, but we also recognize sameness. And we don't make that identity politics something that divides us, but we can come together in all of our differences. We can recognize our differences. We can never not recognize our differences. You know, we're embodied. And I think this is what a lot of Black feminist theory is about. It's that we have an embodied reality. How am I read as a person? I can't not be read. If I sat here and said, I am white with red hair, somebody might want to kind of dispute my claim, okay? Because as an embodied person, they would say, that's not how I see you. And I think this is probably an argument that happens with gender and, you know, how gender is now seen on a spectrum. So for me, I think identity is very fluid, as Alia said, you know, and it's shifting and we're evolving all the time in our understanding of it. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that when we talk about essentialism, we can also go back to subalternity studies and look at strategic essentialism. So how do groups come together, you know, and empower themselves as a group, you know, because even diversity studies have brought it down to the individual. You know, we're not only looking at the group, we're looking at the individual as well. We're looking at the diverse nature of each individual or the diverse identity. But it hasn't necessarily brought about the gains for the individual. We still experience racism, sexism, ableism as individuals. And I always say to people, even if we talk in terms of groups or we talk in terms of structures and systems, we process everything at the individual level, okay? I process racism as me, as Phil, even though I'm part of a group that experiences racism. So essentialism is both limiting, but it's also really important for people to be able to come together and to use that sameness, just the same as women have come together and empowered themselves through feminism. But nobody would say they're essentialized. You know, they take their sameness, they take what it is that is discriminated against. You know, what is that element of them or that so-called essence, that essentialized part of them that is discriminated against? And they come together and they empower each other, you know, as women. So it can have, for me, I think it can be both negative and positive. I do believe in strategic essentialism. You know, the Black Power movement, the feminist movement, you know, disability studies, LAT-CRIS, people come together. You can't unless you recognize your sameness and your difference. Can't move beyond them or progress them in any way as an individual and not recognize that there's somebody standing beside you who's in the exact same position, you know? So I don't know if I've either complicated that or kind of given an explanation of it.
No, thank you very much. No, that's really, I do find Spivak's work on strategic essentialism and others very, very enlightening in this respect. So,
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to you both. Does anybody, we have time for one final question, if anybody has a final question they'd like to pose. Or a comment, a reflection. Lorna. Hi, Lorna.
Hi, thank you. That was a really great presentation and really good insights as well from both speakers and people who posed questions. My question as a social scientist who works with quantitative data, are there frameworks that we can use to develop an intersectional analyses And I guess, how do we work through the complexity of different pathways? Because I'm just being funded to do a study looking at health and well-being within the older LGBT plus community, knowing that there's enormous variation within the community and then as it intersects with different factors. So it's impossible to do all the different iterations of possible overlapping identities. So are there commonly used ways within the social sciences literature to deal with that complexity?
I'm not a quantitative person myself, but I would probably say focus groups, Lorna, would probably be one of the best ways forward. Gosh, yeah, you've caught me. The minute somebody says quantitative, I'm like, oh.
That's okay. No, not at all.
But yeah, I can certainly come back to you on that. I mean, we can discuss this, and I could certainly come back. I'd love to link in with you.
That would be brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll leave my contact details in the comment.
Please do. I need to think sideways.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. Does anybody else want to come in there? Do we have any quantitative analysis people in the room that might want to come in? Okay. Okay, well, it's now, I'll just see if there's a couple of messages in the chat. Okay, that's just people saying thank you so much. So thank you so much to everybody for coming today. I'm sure we're all the richer for it. Thank you so much to our speakers and to the other members of the Trinity team, to Sean and Darina for setting this up, and for you for giving your time on just after a bank holiday when we're all trying to get back into the swing of things. And please do join us on Friday if you can. So thank you very much to everybody. See you again soon.